Welcome to World Social Studies for elementary teachers. This is the third lecture in the War series talking about Civil War. In this lecture, we'll examine Civil War, civil disorder, and compare the dynamics of civil wars with interstate wars. After listening to this lecture, you should be able to accomplish the objectives listed on this slide. One example of the neighborhood effect of globalization is the Arab Spring revolutions that swept North Africa and the Middle East in 2011. The wave began in Tunisia, where weeks of protests toppled the regime in December of 2010, and then moved to Egypt, where the president stepped down in February of 2011 after 18 days of protest. Protesters took to the streets in Libya that same month, hoping to continue the wave of revolution. Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was not willing to simply step down, however, and determined to stop the contagion by violently repressing the protests. This sparked a rebellion as anti-government militias seized towns and villages and captured oil production and shipping facilities, which was Libya's main source of income. The civil war continued through the spring and summer, with separate militias fighting government forces throughout the country. The rebels took the capital Tripoli in August and defeated the last loyalist stronghold, Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, in October. Gaddafi was captured and then killed. The National Transitional Council, the NTC, the acting government of Libya, elected Abdul Rahim al-Kib, a little-known academic, as the new prime minister. The war then in Libya was a fairly brief civil war. As far as civil wars go, it was much smaller and was not as destructive as many civil wars are. It was also not marked by the long-term ethnic conflicts that many wars have. Now, Libya is struggling. The NTC is trying to build a coalition government, a unity government, bringing in the various tribes and the various militias that fought independent of each other in the war into a coherent group that is capable of actually governing Libya. So the Libyan Civil War is a good illustration of some of the differences between a civil war and a regular war, an interstate war, and it illustrates some key concepts of civil wars that we need to understand to think about this phenomena of political violence that we call civil war. It's helpful when thinking about political violence to know where to place violence on a continuum. And there's two types of political violence that we can focus on. One is the internal intrastate violence, and then there's external interstate violence. With intrastate violence, we start at the bottom of the continuum with civil disorder. Civil disorder is when a group of citizens object to the actions of the state and resist state authority. A mob or a riot is an example of civil disorder. It's not rebellion or civil war in the sense that they're not trying to overthrow the government. They're expressing displeasure and doing so in violent ways. Continuing along the continuum and escalating upward, we have rebellion. Rebellion is a state of sustained civil disorder, with the addition that people are not just objecting to the policies of the state, but the very legitimacy of the state is in question. Another difference between civil war and rebellion is the level of violence. People have risen up to resist government with force once you're in a rebellion, whereas civil disorder may or may not have violence associated with it, but rebellion will always have violence. Guerrilla tactics, sustained campaigns, these are all indicators that a rebellion is underway. This is a picture of a Pashtun fighter in the tribal regions of Pakistan, and that area is in a constant state of rebellion against the government of Pakistan. If government officials were to come into that region, they would probably not survive the day. So that's a key difference between rebellion and civil disorder. The next step on the escalation ladder is full-on civil war. Civil war is considered to exist when a rebellion is widespread and the rebel forces have adopted a unified command structure. Now, that's not necessarily the case. For example, the Libyan civil war had several militias that were resisting the government, but those militias were not fighting each other. They were unified in the sense that they had a common enemy, and each militia within its own organization structure had a command structure. So it can properly be seen as a civil war, not simply a rebellion. Typically, the rebels wear uniforms, they coordinate their actions, and they unite under the goal of overthrowing the government. And more than 1,000 people die, which, if you remember from the earlier lecture, is the threshold before we can use the word war. When they do those things, they've met all the conditions of war. And so we've moved from rebellion to a civil war. This is a picture of rebel soldiers in the Darfur region of Sudan. One way to understand civil wars is to look at how they differ from regular interstate wars. One of the key differences is that civil wars are much more difficult to end than regular wars. Here's a picture of Douglas MacArthur signing the Articles of Surrender, accepting the surrender of the Japanese. That war ended, and it was very clear to everyone when the war was over. Civil wars don't have such a clean ending to the war. Sometimes they continue to persist even when agreements have been signed. Now, there's reasons for these differences, and so in this lecture we're going to examine some of those. Now, one of the first differences between an interstate war and an intra-state war is the issue of what the war is fought about. Wars between countries are typically fought over the national interests of those countries. War is such a terrible thing and is so costly that countries typically do not resort to war unless a key fundamental interest of that country has been threatened or jeopardized, something that's worth paying the costs of war to engage in. And so they're fought over national interest. And once one or both sides are exhausted in that conflict, then the cost-benefit calculation changes, and one side is no longer willing to engage in violence in pursuit of that national interest. They would rather sacrifice that interest than continue to pay the costs of war. And so one or both sides decides to end the war, and the war ends. Now, this condition is often absent in a civil war. In a civil war, the wars are often about the legitimacy and composition of the state, not a national interest. And lots of times, particularly in the modern era, these wars are issues of identity. And now, these reasons for fighting a war are difficult to fully end and return the society to peace. In such wars, one side can't simply surrender a piece of territory or pay a reparation fee. When a war is fought over ideology, for example, one side is unlikely to give true allegiance to the victor unless some change of heart has occurred. The war may end, but the loyalty is absent. And part of the problem from the victor's side is that you can't tell from the outside when that change has occurred. And so it's difficult to know when your enemy ceases to be your enemy. What's even worse is when the war is fought along ethnic lines, it becomes impossible to switch sides. So the victor will always be suspicious of the losing side. And the losing side will always withhold their allegiance from the victor. And so while a war may formally end, it may never really end, because it's again impossible for one side to just capitulate. This is a picture of ethnic violence in Rwanda. The people in Rwanda cannot alter their ethnic status. A Hutu cannot just become a Tutsi, and vice versa. And so it's hard to end that war when it's fought over identity issues. Another difference between a regular interstate war and the special case of a civil war is how the war ends. In a regular war, armies can withdraw from one another, but they continue to exist. So here we have a picture of the checkpoint between North and South Korea. And you have the South Korean soldiers in their helmets with the stripe facing the north, with their American ally standing there assisting them. And then just 20 feet away, you have the North Korean soldiers in their olive drab uniforms. Those two countries didn't need to have a whole lot of trust between each other, because both sides maintain their armies at the end of the war. Now, this doesn't happen in a civil war, where in a regular war, the two armies can withdraw from each other. In a civil war, one side is expected to completely demobilize, which exposes that side to the possibility that the winning side would violate the treaty and resume the war and conquer. Whereas in a regular state situation, if one side reneges on the treaty and attacks, the other side still has their army, so they can continue the war. Well, in a civil war, if one side's been completely demobilized, the state still exists, but how can it maintain the national order and pursue the national interest? Because in a civil war, armies can't simply withdraw. The defeated side has to disarm to end the war. There's no buffer, so there's no space to rebuild that trust. This slide shows a picture of rebels in Sierra Leone surrendering their weapons to a UN peacekeeping force. To do this act, to surrender your weapon, requires a tremendous amount of faith in the peace process. It requires a certain level of trust that the winning side is not going to come and destroy your villages now that you've disarmed yourself. So the defeated side is very vulnerable to the violation of the treaty. This makes it difficult to end the war, because the losing side knows how vulnerable they are, and they may determine that they're safer to continue fighting a losing war than to end the war and disarm themselves and be completely vulnerable to the other side. Now, another key aspect of this issue of how do you build trust at the end of a war is the difference between a negative peace and a positive peace. A negative peace is merely the absence of war. So the picture between the North and South Koreans, that's a good example of a negative peace. There's no love between the two countries, but they are not at war, so technically they are at peace. A positive peace is where the conditions have been set for a society to heal the rift between the two sides and unify the country once again. That's a positive peace. It's very difficult to do after a civil war, particularly if it's been fought along ethnic lines where one side is engaged in genocidal actions. How do you unify and rebuild a country after that? So these are a couple of more reasons why civil wars are very different in practice from interstate wars. Another key difference is the actual cost of the war. In an interstate war, there could be tremendous levels of violence, but the violence is engaged from one state to another. It may be targeting civilian areas. It's definitely going to be targeting strategic areas. But typically the war is fought in one country, usually the country that has been attacked. The war is fought on that country's territory until they're defeated or they repulse the invasion. Occasionally they will then counterattack on the territory of the other country. But it's at least possible that the destruction only occurs on one side of the war. In a civil war, on the other hand, both sides are fighting each other, and no matter what they destroy, they're destroying part of their own country. And so the country bears all of the costs of both sides of the war in the destruction of infrastructure and in the amount of people killed. If you look at any tally of war casualties, at least from the United States point of view, the war that killed the most Americans is always the American Civil War, because the soldiers of both sides count towards the total. So this is another reason why it becomes difficult to end a war, because what often happens is that when a side has suffered tremendous losses, they're reluctant to give up to defeat, because then all of their suffering, all of the losses seem to have been in vain, since they ended up losing anyways. And so the losing side is reluctant to stop. So you can see that civil wars have a little different dynamic to them than interstate wars do. And it's important that we understand this dynamic, because most modern warfare is civil war, is intrastate war. As we go back to the global security map, you can see that just on a sheer number basis, the civil wars outnumber the actual wars by a large margin. Once you recall that all of the destruction is occurring within their country and the difficulty that accompanies ending these wars, you'll see that it's a key topic with international relations is to get civil war and what the best strategies are for dealing with those wars. This presentation was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor at Mesa Community College.